Prince William versus Camilla's family, the estate mystery. Imagine this. Prince William walks into an old royal estate carrying a leather folder with an antique royal crest on it. A few minutes later, a decades-old document allegedly changes everything. For years, Camilla's family supposedly believed they had a future connection to this massive estate. Renovation plans had been discussed. Rooms were allegedly being prepared. And people were reportedly starting to treat the property like it could eventually become their family home. But then William steps in. And according to the story, he doesn't yell. He doesn't make a dramatic scene. He simply brings out the paperwork. And suddenly, one old clause becomes more important than years of private promises. Now, before we go any further, I want to make something clear. The specific story we're discussing contains claims that have not been independently established through reliable public records. So, I'm presenting this as an alleged story and analyzing the claims, not telling you that this confrontation definitely happened. Now, here's where things get interesting. The entire story reportedly revolves around an old family settlement. And if you don't understand what that means, the situation can sound much more dramatic than it actually is. Because having the right to live in or manage an estate does not necessarily mean you personally own it. A person can have a lifetime interest in a property while still being legally restricted from deciding who ultimately receives it. That distinction is supposedly at the heart of this story. According to the claim, an old amendment dating back to 1999 contained restrictions on who could eventually receive the property. And that date is what makes the story so interesting. Because it was years before Charles and Camilla were married. The alleged account even claims that the Queen Mother and Princess Margaret were connected to the amendment. If that were true, the timing would be fascinating. It would suggest that the family's succession rules were being carefully structured long before the situation people are talking about today. But again, there is an important difference between an interesting claim and a verified historical fact. We shouldn't confuse the two. Now, according to the alleged story, Charles had supposedly made private assurances about the future of the estate. And this is where things get complicated. Because a private promise can mean a lot inside a family. But legally, a promise is not automatically ownership. That's the key. The story claims that plans were made around the property. Renovations were discussed. Furniture was supposedly being prepared. And there were even claims that certain areas of the estate were being considered for future family use. But allegedly, William began looking at the financial and property records. And what he supposedly found raised a much bigger question. Who actually had the legal right to benefit from the estate? Because if protected estate funds were being used to prepare a property for people who weren't legally entitled to it, the issue would no longer be just a family disagreement. It could become a question of legal responsibility. And that changes everything. Imagine being told for years that a property is going to be part of your family's future. Then one day, someone puts an old document on the table and says, that's not what the legal agreement says. No shouting. No dramatic royal announcement. Just paperwork. And suddenly, everything has to be reconsidered. The renovations. The promises. The expectations. Even the assumption that the family would eventually have control of the property. That's why the most interesting part of this story isn't really the estate itself. It's the idea that inside powerful families, the person making the promise isn't always the person with the legal authority to keep it. And that distinction can stay hidden for years. Until someone checks the documents. Now, the alleged story takes another turn. It claims that alternative arrangements were considered. One possibility was reportedly a family trust. Another was supposedly a long-term lease. On paper, that might sound like a clever solution. The property could technically remain inside the original settlement while another family received long-term use of it. But according to the claim, those arrangements would still require approval under the old rules. And that brings William back into the picture. Because if he really was one of the people responsible for protecting the settlement, then approving a private family arrangement might not simply be a personal decision. It could be a legal responsibility. And that's where this story becomes less about William versus Camilla. And more about personal promises versus legal obligations. Think about that for a second. Charles could make a promise. Camilla's family could believe that promise. But if an old legal agreement says something completely different, the document wins. That's why one of the most powerful lines in this entire story is, assurances are not ownership. Whether or not that exact conversation ever happened, the principle behind it is real. In property law, expectations don't automatically create ownership. Paperwork matters. Trusts matter. Settlements matter. And sometimes, a signature from decades ago can have more power than a promise made yesterday. That's what makes stories like this so fascinating. When we think about the British royal family, we usually think about crowns, palaces, titles and public appearances. But behind all of that is something much less glamorous. Legal documents. property settlements, trustees, inheritance rules, and signatures. Because sometimes the biggest royal power move isn't someone making a speech. It's someone opening an old folder, finding one forgotten clause, and realizing that the rules were written long before anyone in the room knew they would matter. So, if this alleged story teaches us anything, it's this: never confuse a family promise with legal ownership. Because when the paperwork finally comes out, the person with the oldest document in the room might have the strongest position. And that's what makes this alleged royal estate mystery so fascinating. What do you think? If a royal family member makes a private promise about an estate, but an old legal agreement says otherwise, should the promise matter? Or should the paperwork always win? Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you enjoy breaking down the hidden side of royal power, money, inheritance, and family drama, subscribe for more.